There's a saying that goes, if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. That has been, and still does, hold true for the vast majority of low-end Android phones out there. It might be good because your telco has subsidized it heavily in exchange for a years-long contract, or there have been drastic budget cuts that make the user experience barely palatable. Or in the case of the Freedom 251 scandal, a literal scam. But 9 years ago, there was a device that almost defied such notions and propelled its manufacturer to the heights of smartphone fame. This is the Xiaomi Redmi 1 and 1S, possibly the most important budget droids ever made. Before I get to how revolutionary the Redmi was, I think it is useful to recap how the budget smartphone space was like before the Redmi 1 came in. We had just emerged from pseudo-smartphones with touchscreen-based feature phone OSs such as Nokia's Asha series. Nokia and Motorola both sought to redefine what budget could be with the Lumia 520 and Moto G respectively. But without the usual discounts, they were still out of reach from those with the tightest budgets. Also, the 520 had the less popular Windows Phone 8 and the stigma of an app gap. Thus, the lowest tier of Android phones in 2013 is best represented by the likes of, say, the LG Optimus L3 II. Tiny, pixelated quarter VGA screens, dog-slow single-core processors, and no selfie camera. Even by 2013 standards, I would bet that they would not satisfy the vast majority of people out there. So when the Redmi made its international debut starting in February 2014 for the low price of 169 Singapore dollars, it was just like the Kuwait man crashing through the wall, saying, "Oh yeah!" So what's the catch, you might ask? Well, for starters, they were only sold online directly from Xiaomi initially. And you couldn't just walk in and buy anytime. You had to wait for a flash sale to be announced. And demand would always exceed supply, with stock literally sold out in minutes. But there is a reason behind such madness. Besides simplifying inventory and logistics, these flash sales clearly would give Xiaomi free publicity in the media, which in turn would drive FOMO and more customers in turn. Which in turn means more mind and market share, which definitely helps Xiaomi break into markets much more easily as a newcomer. On the surface, the Redmi's hardware seems too plain and generic. From the relatively big bezels to the plastic finish, it screams of a smartphone that would belong in a stock photo, especially without Xiaomi's logo on the front bezel, as was the norm back then. But of course, for the price, it would be insane to ask for premium materials and slim bezels. And with a matte finish, it was still better than the other budget phones it was trying to compete against anyway. In other words, it feels quite sturdy and with a reassuring heft, very similar to how Nokia built their budget Lumia phones. The back shell is removable, and Xiaomi even sold replaceable back covers as well. This is also where you would find the removable battery, dual SIM, and microSD card slot. But who cares about the back when the front is where the attention is at? A 4.7-inch 720p IPS LCD is no longer impressive by today's standards. But when you compare it to the competition at that time, it was miles ahead in size, resolution, and image reproduction. Most rivals were using, at best, WVGA or quarter HD screens. A retina level display at entry level was thus really hard to beat. Continuing on hardware, the Redmi 1 came with the MediaTek MT6589T SoC, a 1.5 GHz quad-core Cortex-A7 with 1 GB of RAM and 4 GB of ROM. Most competitors could match in terms of ROM, but not the RAM and SoC. They usually had at most half a gig of RAM and dual-core SoCs at best, with weaker cores to boot. And the gap will only widen with the Redmi 1S, which used a special edition of the Snapdragon 400 quad-core clocked at 1.6 GHz instead of the usual 1.2 GHz, and doubled the ROM to 8 GB. The camera was also much better than expected for the price, especially in terms of video recording. 5-megapixel cameras with a best WVGA recording was the norm, but the Redmi gave you 8-megapixel stills with 1080p videos. There's no noticeable shutter lag and it don't look too bad even today. It even has a manual HDR and so-called Twilight handheld mode, although I found the latter practically useless. It really isn't a night mode per se. Software was also where the Redmi stood out from all its entry-level peers. MIUI 5 clearly exploited the above-average hardware of the Redmi to deliver a very feature-rich budget experience for the price, even if it could be overwhelming for some. It was one of the first Android skins to offer system-wide theming and downloadable themes. Others at best had a few preloaded themes and nothing else. Theming will only catch on a year or two later for the rest. And like most skins from Chinese brands, MIUI 5 uses an iOS style launcher with no option for an app drawer. There are so many interesting things about MIUI 5 that it will probably take a dedicated video to fully explain them all. Here are just a few that caught my attention when revisiting it. The phone is bundled with Kingsoft's WPS Office. Remember that Google Docs did not debut standalone mobile apps until a few months after the Redmi's international debut. This is likely related to Xiaomi's founder, Lei Jun. He was, and still is, a board member of Kingsoft, having worked his way up from an engineer position. The theme store for MIUI 5 no longer works, but syncing and accessing Mi Cloud is still available. The Task Manager's design is less intuitive than contemporary stock Android. It is not immediately obvious that swiping up is the only way to close an app, since swiping down actually locks the apps into RAM, preventing them from being purged by the built-in Cleaner app. Lastly, it is possible in settings to utilize the volume keys to unlock the phone. This was particularly useful for me, as the power key on my unit had worn down to the extent that it could only be pressed with a SIM ejector pin. Overall, the rich software bundle, while not universally beloved, also contributed significantly for the Redmi's bang for buck scale. Most other brands gave their budget phones cut-down versions of their software skins to compensate for their poorer hardware, but not this one. Despite the controversy surrounding the flash sales method, the Redmi was a smash hit, no doubt because it offered so much bang for buck that it has not been matched in the smartphone world ever since. The Redmi was key to putting Xiaomi on the map, helping it become the third largest smartphone brand by 2015, as well as the world's most valuable startup at that point. It kick-started an entire range of Redmi phones, which in 2019 became its own individual sub-brand. And that might be why it is the most important budget phone ever made, in my humble opinion. Most of the iconic and memorable phones tend to be the flagships or those with very extraordinary gimmicks, but the humble Redmi is an exception. I have a part 2 for this video, or what I call the optional extra, which you can watch right over here. It's mostly about my personal story with the Redmi and Xiaomi's first year in Singapore, plus a commentary about the state of budget phones today, including Xiaomi's. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. It helps feed the algorithm and brings much more attention to my videos. If you enjoyed it, a donation to my Ko-fi will be very much appreciated too. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.